This is the big one, folks. A lot of spoilers ahead, so, tap in the sign now. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. A pretty substantial checkpoint in the Pokémon game series. Ambitious, open-world titles that promise us freedom of the land and sea. I think it's fair to say fans had decently high hopes for Generation 9 of Pokémon, like the naive fools we are. Generation 8 didn't land too well with a lot of people, did it? I actually quite like Sword and Shield. I understand I'm in the minority there. Believe me, I once wrote something complimentary about Spitemath on Reddit, and boy was that the bad idea of the century. It has to be said though that Pokémon Sword and Shield epitomised the cookie-cutter Pokémon formula in pretty much every area. They really phoned it in with this one. So Pokémon fans were hoping for something to break the mold a little bit more this time around. Maybe give Charizard a chance to use some vacation days, because this boy's been on the clock a lot lately. I remember Scarlet and Violet being announced in February 2022. It was a bit of a surprise because we'd just gotten Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl and Pokémon Legends Arceus in the last 3 months. What do you mean there's another one coming later this year? Look, I know we've all become accustomed to the 3-year cycle when it comes to mainline games, but I hadn't even started playing Legends Arceus yet and already a new game's beginning its hype cycle? Okay, where can I pre-order? And so, on the 18th of November 2022, these games were released to the world. Since then, we've had fun, we've had controversy, 2 DLCs, an epilogue, and now, my friends, it's time to reflect. So sit back, settle in, and let's take a comprehensive look back at Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. After some basic character setup and a fun little intro cutscene, the games open how every Pokémon game does. We go through the typical opening rituals, choosing our starter, battling our main rival, learning how to catch a Pokémon, and then our brand new adventure can begin. The first task, acquiring the legendary Pokémon. Sorry, what was that? Yep, we technically get the box legendary within the first 20 minutes of the game. We can't battle with it though, it's not part of our 6 Pokémon team. It's actually going to be our ride Pokémon for our entire adventure. Pokémon games did away with HMs a couple of generations back now, plunging many Bidoof into unemployment, so they've had the challenge of finding ways to replace them in recent games. Fly's a pretty simple one. The flying taxi's got that covered forever, in my opinion, so they'll probably remove it in the next game. It's HMs like Surf and Rock Climb that they've had to find other, more creative solutions for. And ride Pokemon seem to be what they like playing around with at the moment. Not my cup of tea, personally. It was a whole mess in Legends Arceus. Seriously, the amount of times I'd accidentally switch to the wrong ride Pokemon and end up blacking out to a wild Pokemon as a result. If you enjoy searching for satchels in that game, let me tell you, I've got you covered until these games circle back for a remake. But I will say, it does work quite well here, because it's just one ride Pokemon that does everything. So it's more intuitive. So how it works is we find Koraidon or Miraidon in a weakened state, and they gain more abilities as we progress through the game, like being able to swim, climb, glide, all that good stuff. I really wasn't sure about this at first, it seemed kind of wacky, but after a while, I came to enjoy the idea of having the box legendary take a bigger role in the game than simply being a static encounter near the very end of it. I felt myself building genuine rapport with these legendaries over the course of my playthrough, which is funny considering I wasn't particularly excited by them when they were first revealed. I think a lot of people were a bit perplexed by having Pokemon based on motorcycles. I know when I saw them I was like, yeah, we really are done as a society, aren't we? But I ended up enjoying these legendaries in the end. I do miss the bicycle though, I hope it comes back in later games. So it takes about an hour to push through the initial tutorial section of the game, which seems like a long time. It can definitely feel like a drag, but in my opinion it is necessary to plant the foundations of the game. While this is sold as a big open world to run around in, there's a lot going on in these games that needs that setup. You've also got to bear in mind that every Pokemon game is going to be someone's first Pokemon game. So I don't have too many complaints about the whole hand-holdy section at the beginning of this one. It's a necessary evil in many ways. In these games, we take on the character of a new student at the Naranja/Yuva Academy, depending on the version. Now, I'm an adult playing these games, so it doesn't really make all that much difference to me. But if I was a kid coming home from school and looking forward to enjoying some Pokemon, I think I'd probably find it a tad jarring to be basically switching one school uniform for another. The fact you can't switch out of that school uniform at any point during the base game is a little disappointing too. I like the spring version, but the others really aren't for me. I don't think I've come across many Pokemon players that don't enjoy customizing the hell out of their in-game character. I'm pretty tame with it, I just like my character to look kinda like me. but boy have I seen some beautiful abominations in multiplayer during my time. Clothing in particular is a great way to distinguish yourself. Having only hairstyles and a few facial features as the bulk of character discriminators makes seeing other players that look pretty much exactly like you a far more common occurrence this time around. But on the other side of that, I get it, the game is centered around you being a student, students wear uniforms. So we're inducted into our new school, we're shown to our own personal dorm room, and I'll be honest with you, you're not going to be seeing much more of this place until very later on. While the entire game is based around you being a student here, and you're forced to wear the uniform at all times, you're never required to be here for the most part. There are plenty of classes you can take, where sometimes you'll learn some interesting Paldea lore, and sometimes you'll do basic elementary maths. I do wish the story brought you back here more often, but because it doesn't, there really isn't much here. We have this grand open entrance area here, but there's not all that much to interact with. Everywhere else in the school is simply accessed via this control panel at the front desk. So while this front area looks beautiful, I would have loved a sprawling school where I can run around in the corridors and initiate the classes a bit more naturally, rather than through the same menu screen over and over. It's a missed opportunity. So speaking of story, these games feature 3 separate story paths: Victory Road, Path of Legends, and Starfall Street. Victory Road is your traditional gym badge quest. You defeat 8 gym leaders, collect 8 badges, and then challenge the Pokemon League to become the new champion of the region. It's the tried and true Pokemon experience. For returning players, it's business as usual. We all know the score. This path's introduced to us by our main rival for these games, Nemona. She's another student at the academy, already a league champion when we meet her, and she loves Pokemon battling. She's accumulated a fair bulk of comparison to Goku. She actively cheers you on to get stronger just so she can enjoy an even bigger challenge when she battles you again. If Senzu beans were a thing in the Pokemon world, she'd be forcing them down your throat like Skittles. Opinion on Nemona is divided from what I've seen. She definitely takes the whole friendly rival trope we've seen in later games to a whole new level. So I can see how she'd be a little too overbearing for a lot of people. But you know what? I quite like Nemona. I think if a rival is going to be this relentlessly jolly and upbeat, it's good that she's at least strong. She is actually a genuine challenge when you come up against her. That was my experience anyway. I am terrible at Pokemon battling though. I swear, until like a year and a half ago, I thought rock types were immune to electric types. I'm blaming Brock's gym for that one. Gyms nowadays basically boil down to how interesting the gym leaders are as characters, and how memorable the gym challenges are too. I feel like a lot of us feel that the gym challenges in recent games are a bit dull and a bit easy, and you would be absolutely correct in saying that. But honestly, gym puzzles have never been anything crazy. For the most part, they've always been simple little puzzles like flipping switches in the right order or moving boulders to the correct positions, which I totally don't struggle with at all as a fully grown man. I actually thought some of the puzzles in Scarlet and Violet were pretty fun. The olive roll challenge in Cortondo is pretty hilarious. It's one of those instances where the sort of janky controls within the game actually makes it more entertaining. The Sunflora hide and seek challenge in Artisan is kind of fun too. It's a nice way to explore the town, despite the terrifying frame rate issue going on here. There are definitely some more painful ones though, like the emotional spectrum challenge in Alphanada. Who the hell greenlit this thing? You're just told which buttons to press on your controller and you push them. What am I gaining from this? At least with mundane ones like the seaweed auction, it's introducing you to a mechanic or feature within the game. But this serves no purpose at all. They've done alright with the gym challenges in this game though. They just seem to have run out of ideas or maybe even time for a couple of them. As for the gym leaders themselves, I think we've got a decent crop in these games. We've got the intentionally obnoxious live streamer who holds up a mirror to modern influencer culture, an ex-professional snowboarder who's trying to rebuild his life after a career-ending accident, a jaded salaryman who's so bland and ordinary that he somehow became this ultra-relatable cultural icon within the Pokemon community. Seriously, we got a lot of larger-than-life characters in this game, and we, as a collective, came together and said, now this is the guy. Like I said, gyms are pretty much a given in any mainline Pokemon game. Only the Gen 7 games have broken that pattern so far. So it's a tall task to keep them feeling fresh and keep developing characters that engage the player and actually leave a lasting impression. But Scarlet and Violet did well here, I think. Feel free to let me know your favourite Generation 9 gym leader down in the comments. The Elite Four in this game though are very forgettable for me. For a start, we have to go through this weird entrance exam before we can even start battling, which is basically just remembering the types the gym leaders use, and then there's no wrong answer to any of the other questions. The first member is Rika, who doesn't have that much personality beyond calling us kiddo, but she looks cool. Then there's Poppy, whose whole thing is literally just being a kid. Then Larry's reused as an Elite Four member. Guess that's a plus for the Larry groupies. And Hassel, who's probably my favourite of the four, who actually has some decent backstory. Geeta is the champion of the region. She's also the chairwoman of the league. I think we all thought there was going to be more to Geeta than meets the eye. She seems kind of enigmatic, and she has a Glamora as her ace Pokemon, which is a Pokemon only found in the deepest parts of Area Zero. We all thought something was a bit sus here, but it turns out, nah, that's just Geeta. So a bit of an anticlimactic character in my opinion. Decent champion battle though. Path of Legends has us hunting down a bunch of giant Pokemon called Titans, and learning more about each variant of the mysterious and very rare Herba Mystica, which are these magical herbs that are said to have incredible effects. And like any magical herb giving special effects, you can't just buy them, you gotta know a guy. This path is introduced by Arven. He's another one of our fellow students. He's not much of a Pokemon battler, which is why he enlists our help to deal with these giant Pokemon guarding the Herba Mystica. This guy gave me massive Draco Malfoy vibes when we first met. He doesn't make the best first impression, but his true character and motivations come out as we progress through the Path of Legends. Arven is a sandwich connoisseur. That's his thing, and initially makes out like he's searching out the Herba Mystica in order to make the perfect sandwich. But we later come to find that he in fact wants to use them to try and heal his most treasured Pokemon, Mebostiff, who's been critically injured during a battle down in the secretive, off-limits crater in the middle of the region. And we quickly become sympathetic to his cause as we track down the Herba Mystica, and each one seems to provide a tiny bit of progress in Mebostiff's health. This is also how our Ride Legendary gets their abilities unlocked. Each Herba Mystica gives us a new upgrade. There is an issue I have with this path that I noticed more so during the second and third playthroughs of the game, and it's a direct knock-on effect of the freedom we're given to do these quests in any order we want. Every time we defeat a Titan and head into the cave behind it, it's the exact same cave interior, with our characters positioned in the exact same spots, over and over again. But stupidly, it has to be this way, because otherwise the developers would have had to create a ridiculous amount of variations of each scene, depending on whether we did this particular Titan Pokemon first, or second, or third, and so on. The fact that there is no linear order to do these Titans in, forces the sort of cutscene portions afterwards to all share this same generic staging. It's a little bit disappointing, and I'll definitely be circling back around to the non-linear issues later on. As far as the base game is concerned though, I feel like this storyline is what the game will largely be remembered for. Arven's story is a heartbreaking one. He's the son of the region's professor, who he hasn't seen or even been in contact with for years. His ace Pokemon is critically wounded, and this moment, after finding the final Herba Mystica and initially thinking it still hadn't been enough, leading to this interaction as Mebostiff is finally able to rise to his feet. I saw a lot of tears from a lot of people who were live streaming their first playthroughs. It's a genuine feeling of payoff, and it highlights the relationship between people and Pokemon in this world. The side may be lesser explicitly seen in the video game side of the franchise. Sure, they are utilised for battle in our efforts towards becoming a champion trainer and defeating bad guys, but they're also our companions. And I really think it was an intentional decision to cast a dog Pokemon in this role here, because a lot of us have dogs, a lot of us have pets, and it instinctively makes us project our feelings towards our own non-human friends onto this narrative here. It's a heartwarming conclusion that I feel will be a particularly vivid memory of this game when we look back in 5 or 10 years' time. Starfall Street is basically the evil team segment of the game. So every Pokemon game has some sort of evil group that's trying to cause trouble in the region. They've softened up considerably in more recent titles, that's probably a whole video in itself. But in Scarlet and Violet we are locking horns with Team Star, which sounds like something straight out of Camp Rock. Team Star are a bunch of students just like us, but they've developed a reputation for bullying fellow classmates and pressuring other trainers to join their ranks. Which, why wouldn't you want to join a club where everyone ends every conversation by doing this? We're introduced to this path via an ominous phone call from someone called Cassiopeia, who's heard that you're a strong up-and-coming trainer and wants to enlist your help to take down Team Star. Basically, it entails you going around the numerous Team Star bases dotted throughout Paldea, and defeating them one by one to bring the group's malicious endeavours to an end once and for all. These bases make use of a new mechanic introduced in this generation called Let's Go, where you can send your Pokemon out and they will auto-battle the Pokemon around it. It's a great little mechanic. It helps a lot with grinding. If you've caught a Pokemon that needs to gain a few levels, this mechanic will save you a lot of time. There is a trade-off. Your Pokemon don't get as much XP from auto-battling as they would from regular battling. But yeah, it's convenient if you're just looking to grind a few levels before your next battle. Once you're inside the Team Star bases, you have to use the Let's Go mechanic to knock out 30 Pokemon, and then you can face the boss of that star base. It is the exact same challenge every time, which could have been tweaked maybe. It does get very repetitive. Basically, as long as you're not going in with Pokemon that are weak to that base's type speciality, you're not going to run into any problems here. I just feel like they could have maybe at least alternated with a different kind of challenge, rather than just going with the 30 Let's Go knockouts every single time. You definitely don't want to be doing 2 or 3 of these bases in a row. The Team Star boss battles are quite the genuine challenge though. I found myself really enjoying these. Each boss has a few Pokemon, but their final Pokemon is the car itself they ride in on. Okay, first motorbikes, now cars. It's the thing hanging to the front that's the actual Pokemon. A Pokemon called Revavroom. Look, I've tried about 100 times now to say this Pokemon's name without it sounding stupid. It's not happening apparently. This works a lot like the Titan battles where it has a huge HP bar, and they're quite hard to beat. During the run I recorded for this video, I wiped against these things on more than one occasion. But I like that about it. The game would be boring if I just swept past every battle. It's revealed as we progress through these bases that in fact Team Star weren't the bullies after all. They were the students being bullied. If you can believe it, this group of people right here weren't the ones doing the bullying. Basically, when it reached the point of retaliation from their side, they mistakenly got painted as the bad guys. And some deleted student records along with a change in leadership at the school meant that that perception was never corrected. I mentioned earlier that evil teams have gotten a little softer recently, compared to the evil corporations looking to enslave the world types we had in earlier games, but I liked the direction they went in with this one. It presents you with a villain archetype, and then puts you in a position where you're forced to empathize with them. It presents the sad cycle we often see where the bullied can often become the bullies, or at least painted as the bullies if they dare to stand up for themselves, and how situations of conflict aren't always what they appear to be at face value. The final twist in this story is when the mysterious Cassiopeia you've been communicating with is revealed to be none other than your shy, introverted classmate, Penny. Which, trust me, isn't that much of a twist if you've been paying even a little bit of attention. Penny is in fact the leader of Team Star, and challenges you to one final battle so she can formally disband the group without any regrets. I have a question here. So essentially Team Star are doing this whole thing with the bases to try and entice their boss to return. After everything that went down at the school, their boss was sent to study abroad for a while. They don't know that their boss is Penny. She never revealed herself to them either. So if Penny really does have this power to simply step in and say, guys, stop it, we're disbanding right now. Now you're back in Paldea, why not just show yourself and do that? I kind of understand going around the bases and defeating them. It sort of undermines their power and status. But it's mainly this final battle with her at the end that seems completely unnecessary for me. Like, what happens if she beats us in this final fight? She does mention that a small part of her wants Team Star to continue on, but in that case, if you're that unsure about it, why ask us to run around the entire region defeating all of your members? I feel like these are the questions we're not supposed to ask, but the finale to this whole Team Star thing does feel a little rushed and improvised. I feel like it would have been better if Penny was the voice behind Cassiopeia, but wasn't the final boss of Team Star. There's no tension in this battle with Penny because she kinda wants you to win. I would have preferred some genuine hostility and friction in this final bout that's deciding the entire fate of Team Star. Overall, a perfectly palatable story though, has a decent moral to it, and Clive will forever be a fabulous man. Once you've finished all 3 paths in these games, there is one more place to explore. A place we've been running endless circles around for our entire experience so far. The Great Crater of Paldea. We meet back up with Arven at the Lighthouse Lab, where the Professor appears on screen and says they need our help with the final step of their research down in Area 0, and to bring some reliable allies to help us tackle the things we're gonna see down there. So of course we grab the whole gang and head to Zero Gate right on the edge of the crater. And this moment here, this had me tingling. This game did such a good job of building mystique and anticipation around the Great Crater. I'd been waiting for this moment for what seemed like a lifetime, and here we finally were, about to dive down and see what exactly this thick layer of mist has been concealing. And I've got to give it to you, Game Freak, this is really something. Area Zero hit me unlike anything else ever has in a Pokemon game. Something about the blend of the colour grading, the almost extraterrestrial landscape, the biting soundtrack. You truly feel like you're on forbidden ground. They really have done a good job with this place. It's going to take something special to top in future releases, that's for sure. We also encounter some new Pokemon down here, but they're not entirely new Pokemon. They are, depending on your version, either ancient or future paradoxical forms of existing Pokemon. And depending on your taste, they're either a fresh take on Pokemon you didn't really care for, or they're a complete bastardization of Pokemon you held dearly. They have different typings, they don't evolve, and they look quite weird. We have to defeat a fair few of these strange Pokemon as we gradually spiral our way down the crater, and they really sell this place even further as this completely different world. You almost forget that you are still in the very center of the Paldea region. Everything down here is just so foreign and different. Then we reach the depths of the crater, and the Zero Lab, which we initially enter alone to find the professor slumped in the corner. Is something wrong? Are they sick? It turns out no. They are in fact a robot, an AI counterpart created by the original professor who was killed during an incident that destroyed one of Area Zero's research stations. Yeah, this goes from 0 to 100 real quick. This AI version of the Professor has called us down here because they want us to shut down the time machine that the original Professor built. The one that's been bringing all these weird Pokemon to this timeline. To do that, we're going to have to defeat the Professor themselves. Because apparently when the time machine's shutdown switch is flipped, a defense mechanism is going to kick in which will override the AI Professor's programming and initiate a battle with them. I swear, like 10 minutes ago I was taking sunset pictures on the beach, and now I'm battling a robot for the fate of the region. Life comes at you fast. So that's exactly what we do. The override kicks in and we battle the AI Professor. The battle itself is pretty challenging. I don't think there's a single playthrough I've done where I haven't had to spam a few max potions to get through it. It's a worthy final boss battle for the base game. After defeating the Professor, the gang catches up to us, and there's this brief sentimental moment between the AI Professor and Arven. This AI has all the memories and personality of the original Professor, and it's one of the few times during the story that we see Arven drop the stoic mask he so often wears. One of the few genuine moments of vulnerability from him. But it's interrupted as a second security protocol activates. The room glows a menacing red, and terrestrial energy envelops the AI Professor. This is our real final battle, and it's against the Box Legendary. The legendary that wounded our Ride Legendary and killed the original Professor. But all of our Pokeballs are locked shut by the protection protocol. All but one. Our Ride Legendary, who has finally regained its full power and now has the ability to battle. And so begins the rematch of the century. This is such a good way to end the main story. We started off by finding our legendary slumped on a beach, bruised and weak from the battle with this counterpart, and we're finishing up by completing its comeback. It's a nice full circle moment. The saga concludes with the Professor exclaiming that they themselves appear to be intrinsically linked to the time machine, and as long as they remain, it can never be fully shut down. And so the Professor opts to use the time machine one last time to transport themselves to the past or future timeline they've been studying permanently. After some heartfelt words, the Professor floats up and disappears into the white glow of the portal above us, leaving an eerie silence as the time machine finally shuts down completely. This is a really touching moment because it's the moment where Arven finally starts to gain a sense of closure. He says himself that although he knew this AI Professor wasn't his real parent, that it felt real, and that was enough for him. And we also see the genuine bonds that have been created between the main characters here in the interactions that follow. And so we head home. I would be lying if I said I didn't get a lump in my throat during this final scene here. This isn't a happy ending, but it's one where we see the power of shared experience. How going through extraordinary trials and ordeals can bring together even the most different of people. And then Ed Sheeran pops by to serenade us through the credits and trigger copyright strikes across the streamosphere. So those are the 3 story paths in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, along with a shared finale. 3 separate story paths all happening at the same time. Or consecutively. This is the thing. We do have free reign over how we progress through the game, which I can tell has been implemented in good faith, but it doesn't really work in practice. For the primary reason that there is no level scaling in these games. Yes, you can tackle these 18 badges in any order you like, but it doesn't make much sense to. A few of them are very close level-wise, but 99% of the time, you are better off just doing them in the correct order. Because if you, for example, tried to do the entirety of the star bases first, you'd only be able to catch low-level Pokemon to train up, because you wouldn't have the gym badges for higher-level Pokemon to obey you. Alright, so what if you decided to do all the gyms first then? Okay, but you'd be stuck travelling around the region without any of the additional ride powers that you get from defeating the Titans. You're just better off doing them in level order. Like I said, I can see what they're trying to do here, but it just doesn't really pull off in the way that it was meant to. So let's take a few moments to talk about the world of these games. These games take place in the Paldea region, heavily based on the real-life countries of Spain and Portugal. I like the Paldea region a lot, or I should probably say that I like the concepts of the towns and cities a lot. The locations in Paldea do a pretty good job of being an aesthetically pleasing facade. I can take some genuinely nice snapshots in places that make Paldea look vibrant, and busy, and full of life. Drop yourself slam bang in the centre of any of Paldea's towns, and you'll probably feel a half-decent sense of immersion. You'll see NPCs walking around, you'll be surrounded by different buildings and landmarks, and the detail's nothing to scoff at. One of the things that kinda takes me out of the experience though, is the hard boundaries of most of these towns. They don't taper away gradually as you leave. It's just 1 minute you're in the centre of a metropolis, and 10 seconds down the road you're in the middle of a big empty field. Which to be honest is a bit like living in Northern England. There are hard cuts between environments, and I would have liked to see, especially the bigger cities like Levincia, have a more suburban buffer on the outskirts to prevent that from happening. You also can't do all that much in most of these towns. After running around for a few minutes, you will see that these locations are for the most part very hollow. And I think that comes as a direct result of the open world they're set in, and possibly the time afforded to building it. Now to be fair, I'm not one of those fans who's demanding that we should be able to enter every building in a Pokemon game, but a few is always nice. Even just being able to enter the cafes and clothing stores. Walking into the doorway of these stores simply throws you straight into a menu, which I guess you could argue is a time-saving measure for players, but it throws you off at first. It's one of those basic things. When you walk into a door in a video game, you expect to appear again on the other side of it. If they weren't going to do interiors in this game, why not make these outlets outside markets or open front stores? They did it with the Pokemon centers, and I think it works decently well. It would take away that jarring experience and make things look a little more natural. Another important thing for me in a video game is feeling like I'm well and truly in the world. And that requires a lot more work when your game map is open world. Scarlet and Violet are the first Pokemon games to go fully open world. Well, actually not fully. Mesagoza and Area Zero are separated by loading screens, so like 90% open world. But I found myself feeling most of the time like I'm on top of a huge flat tabletop, rather than being in a world. That's sort of the best way I can describe it. It feels like I can see too much. Like, imagine you're watching a movie, but the whole time the camera is zoomed out by an extra 50%. So you can see the edges of the set and all the empty space and background environment that's not supposed to be in shot. And not only can you see it, you can walk up to it and see how fake it is. Going back to Pokemon Sword and Shield, when I'm in Motostoke or Winden, there are decently detailed backdrops set behind the city we're in. But in Scarlet and Violet, they'd have to worry about making all this stuff accessible to the player, because it's an open world. So in Scarlet and Violet, it just simply doesn't exist. Or in some instances it does, but it can't be interacted with regardless. Look out into the distance in Sword and Shield, and you'll see a nice city skyline or picturesque rolling hills and forests. The locations have nice, naturally receding backdrops. In Scarlet and Violet, the distant views will almost always be dominated by empty fields. Every town looks incredibly remote because of this. like they've been constructed like a movie set, and then dropped in the middle of nowhere. And this is what I mean by feeling like I'm on top of a huge table. I personally would much rather have a closed world that looks and feels full than an open world that looks and feels empty. That's the gist of it. It's a hot take, but I actually think Sword and Shield did it best with the wild areas. Rather than the whole map being open world, why not just have a few wild areas scattered around the map? That way you don't get this barren emptiness covering a good 80% of the map. I don't know, I'm just a big advocate of only having in the game what needs to be in the game. I love the idea of an open world Pokemon game, like many others do, but time and resources have to be taken into account. It's a grand idea that could never realistically have a grand execution, at the moment anyway. And here's the thing too, in Paldea you tend to spend most of your time in these empty plains while you're travelling around. You spend surprisingly little time in the towns and cities themselves. I mean, if you like games with sprawling open areas, I suppose you'll like them a lot. I am probably bringing more personal preference into this point than I should be right now, and I will say that there are plenty of different biomes in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. It doesn't all look the same, which is good, but there isn't a whole lot here aside from Pokémon spawning. And items, lots and lots of items. I was not prepared for the egregious amount of sparkles I would encounter on the ground every 15 to 20 yards, sometimes even more frequently. It's actually a little distracting for someone like me who simply has to pick up every single one out of fear that I may be missing out on something useful if I ignore them. My qualms with the open world style in general aside though, I like the region. I think Paldea has a lot of character to it, and some genuinely really beautiful locations. I just wonder what could have been if what we got was somewhere closer to the middle. Maybe if the routes between towns were more linear like previous games, but just without as many loading screens. I feel like the open world is one of the more hot topics in the newer games, so please do let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. For now, let's move on and talk about the Pokédex in these games. As always, a new Pokémon game comes with a fresh batch of Pokémon. Altogether, there are 114 new ones introduced in Generation 9. Among the most eagerly anticipated in any new generation are the 3 starter Pokémon. And in my opinion, we got a pretty good lineup this time around. I really like all 3 of these starters. Sprigatito has quickly become one of my favourite Pokemon. Fuecoco's a goofy little dude you can't not love. And Quaxley, while being a lot of people's least favourite if Twitter's anything to go by, has more than its fair share of unique charm about it. What I will say is that while the base forms of these starters are incredibly strong, their evolutions aren't so exciting for me. I actually didn't evolve my starter Sprigatito at all during my first playthrough. It's still a level 100 baby to this day. The one exception here for me being Fuecoco, and you're probably already guessing why. Yes, I'm not a big fan of humanoid Pokemon, mainly the ones that just look like a human in a cosplay suit. That part all comes down to personal preference though. Maybe you'll love those kinds of Pokemon and that's totally fine. I'd say we got a mixed bag with the Pokédex in these games. There are some really fresh designs such as Tinkerton, Grafaiai, Ceruledge, Satitan, alongside some more forgettable ones. I'll hold off on giving examples of those to avoid the inevitable backlash. Tell you what, come join one of my live streams on Twitch if you want to hear what those ones are. And of course, as we tend to, we get a few new evolutions for older Pokemon. Primeape gets a new evolution, Annihilate, which is absolutely fantastic. It makes use of an older Pokédex entry that mentions it getting so angry that it dies. And so once it's used Rage Fist 20 times, it now evolves into a part Ghost type. We also have Farigiraf, an evolution to Girafarig. Being a Gen 2 fanboy, I liked this a lot. I love what they've done with the 2 heads becoming one when it evolves. Dunsparce finally gets an evolution in what is possibly the greatest troll of the franchise so far. Fans have been asking for a Dunsparce evolution for a long time. And I think it's fair to say we all wanted a Magikarp to Gyarados kind of deal, but instead he just becomes long. Fair play, Pokemon. We've also come to expect a few regional variants nowadays. Older Pokemon given a new look and typing as a result of living in and adapting to a different region. Just a couple this time around. Wooper gets a simple variant and a new evolution, and Tauros gets 3 variants with different typings. Why so little? That's because we have a new kind of regional variant introduced in these games, that technically isn't a regional variant at all. They are entirely different species of Pokemon that just so happen to look like other Pokemon, and they're given comically similar names to go along with it as well. We have Wiglet and Wugtrio, Toadscool and Toadscruel, Speaking of which, I have never tried to shiny hunt one of these guys, but I keep finding them. Poltergeist and Sinistchar. Convergent species, I think, is the term we've settled on. Even now, I'm still not 100% set with my opinion on these. I like that it's something a little more out of the box, but at the same time, I kind of feel like I'd just be happier with traditional regional variants. We also have the new Paradox forms we spoke about earlier, which are just really crazy, foreign-looking versions of existing Pokemon. But again, they are their own distinct Pokemon with their own Pokédex numbers. I like them a lot, and actually, I'd love to see them built on in some way with a future game. I'd love to step into the timelines these alternate Pokemon come from and see what else is there. Imagine a full Pokédex of Paradox Pokemon. I think that'd be really cool to see. So a lot of new stuff has been squashed into the Pokédex this time around. One thing I really love as well though, is how retro some of the designs look in Generation 9. Pokemon like Smoliv and Lechonk and Squawkabilly all look like they would be right at home in Generations 1 to 3. There's a lot of conversation that goes around regarding Pokemon design philosophy and how it's changed over the years, but it's designs like these that make me realise that the core philosophy really hasn't changed all that much. It's just been built upon as we've entered the 3D generations. Then we have the Legendaries. Koraidon and Miraidon are without a doubt the Legendaries we spend the most time with in Pokemon games so far. We're riding around on them from day one. We learn a lot about them as we progress through the game. They're very much at the centre of the Scarlet and Violet experience, which, as I said earlier on, is something I quite like, as a welcome change from the Legendaries just being an optional static encounter way towards the end of the game. There's also a secondary group of Legendaries, Wo-Chien, Chien-Pao, Ting-Lu, and Chi-Yu. This is the Ruinous Quartet, or the Treasures of Ruin. These Legendaries have a pretty interesting backstory you can learn about at the school. They're locked away in shrines across the region, and to unlock these shrines and catch them, you have to find 32 of these glowing stakes sticking up from the ground across the region. 8 for each Legendary. Nice setup for a Paldea Legends game someday, just saying. So the Pokédex gets a solid 8 out of 10 for me. I'd say my favourites from Paldea are Sprigatito, Daxbun, and Annihilate. Feel free to tell me yours too. Let's take a little look at some of the new mechanics we haven't mentioned yet. Sandwiches play a large part in this game. Opening up a picnic and building certain kinds of sandwiches will grant you boosts to the types of Pokemon that spawn, the chance of them having a mark, the size of the Pokemon, better odds of them being shiny if you use sandwiches containing Herba Mystica. You can make some really funky combinations for these sandwiches. I love the ones that are just like peanut butter and 3 small chunks of banana on a huge baguette. Making these sandwiches is quite fun for the first few. The only real complaint I have with constructing these sandwiches is how rubbery the ingredients are. It's all too easy to have a piece of cucumber bounce off the bread like a pinball and ruin the sandwich. So it's definitely smart to save your game before making one, especially if you're using rare ingredients. The battle gimmick for this generation is Terastallization. Once activated, this allows one of your Pokemon to take on a different typing for the duration of that battle, which is whatever its designated Terra type is. Any moves it has of that typing are also given a sizable boost. It's quite useful to use defensively in a lot of ways. If you have a Charizard and you're against a Blastoise, usually you wouldn't hold out much hope. But if your Charizard has the Dragon Terra type, once you Terastallize, it's now no longer weak to water. It's a mechanic that opens up a lot of interesting strategies for battling. I'm not a huge fan of the crowns above the Pokemon's heads though. I get that we need some sort of discriminator so we can clearly see which type a Pokemon is Terastallized into, but I would have preferred for it to be more like some sort of aura, rather than this weird physical thing that sits on their heads. That's really the only complaint I have about Terastallization though. I really enjoy it as a gimmick. I think it's really fun, and there's a lot of creativity to be had with it. So as an extension of Terastallization, as you run around the region, you'll encounter these crystals sticking up from the ground. These are Terra Raids. If you've played Sword and Shield, they're very similar to the Dynamax raids you find around the wild area. A Pokemon will appear before you with a certain Terra type, and you're encouraged to team up with other players to defeat them, catch them if you want to, and you'll get a bunch of item rewards at the end as well. I really dislike Terra Raids. I think there was a good idea here, but it just hasn't worked out in actuality. Instead of the turn-based system using Sword and Shield's Dynamax raids, Terra Raids attempt to be more naturally flowing in just letting everyone go at it at whatever pace they desire. A bit like raids in Pokemon Go, I guess. The problem though is that you get stuck in this horrible twister of revolving effects and stat changes. and sometimes the raids will just freeze everyone out for a minute or so, and you're just standing there unable to do anything. Often you'll be in the middle of selecting an attack or a cheer, and oh, the menu's just disappeared again, because the raid boss is nullifying an effect or something. All the while, the timer at the top of the screen is still going down, regardless of anything else going on. It's the one thing that never freezes during these raids. Believe it or not, Terror raids now aren't as painful as they once were in the first few months after release. But they're still a slow, clunky, buggy, just absolute nightmare to have to go through. This is probably my harshest criticism of the game, because these raids are just barely playable for me. Like I said, a very good idea in concept, but something needs to be done here to make these kinds of raids more fluid. I only do Terror raids when I absolutely have to, otherwise I stay well away. And I suppose that's a decent segue into talking about the general performance of these games. I've made it this far without talking about it, but yeah, it has to be addressed. These games perform pretty terribly in a lot of places. It was a whole thing when the games were first released. Social media was flooded with people's screen grabs of bugs and glitches and 5 FPS windmills. Scarlet and Violet were met with some pretty rough critique, and rightly so. No game should be going on the shelves in the conditions these ones did. There have been a few patches and fixes for certain things, but in general, overall performance hasn't changed that much since day one. The game lags and chugs in quite a few areas, especially if you're swimming across water. My god, if you are prone to motion sickness, stay away from the water, just trust me on that one. Map textures and characters pop in and out constantly, the lighting flickers in a lot of places, and a lot of it seems like a direct consequence of how the world is built itself. It's obvious that a lot of corners were cut. It straight up looks like a Nintendo 64 game in a lot of places. You can just tell that these games needed a little more time in the oven. Like, an extra year would have changed the reviews on this game completely, I think. Because the performance and the hasty world building are the main things letting it down. The problems are so invasive to even the most simple parts of gameplay that they're hard to ignore. I have no doubt that Pokemon are aware of this, and I do still hold out hope that things will be reshuffled, re-strategized, so that Pokemon games can be better optimized in the future. I might be being a naive optimist there, but we've seen stuff happening behind the scenes with Pokemon recently. Pokemon Works being established. I'm hoping things like this are being put in place to better distribute time and resources to make sure games aren't being released unfinished, basically. Only time will tell on that one. The next release is going to be a very pivotal moment for the series, because this simply cannot happen again. I will say that a lot of the extreme glitches that were being posted on social media were glitches I never experienced. And some you did have to really go out of your way to force them to happen. But also, they just shouldn't happen regardless. So I think that covers Scarlet and Violet when it comes to the base game. But as we all know nowadays, the base game isn't all we get. Just like Sword and Shield, we were all waiting eagerly for a DLC to drop. Now, we didn't know what this DLC was going to be. The only thing that united a large portion of Pokemon fans was that we were certain that it was going to take place in this greyed out area in the northeast of the map here. An area that was barricaded with a 300-foot cliff. And the rumours heavily featured talks of Kalos. Because, well, geographically speaking, Kalos is right on the other side of this greyed out area. So were we getting Southern Kalos? Something to do with Zygarde, maybe? Theories were flying around everywhere. And they were all completely and utterly wrong. The first DLC, the Teal Mask, had us venturing on a school trip to a brand new region called Kitakami. Actually, it's unsure if Kitakami is a region in itself. It would be a tad strange for a region to just have the one small town in it, so I'm guessing if Kitakami is the region, it's just a small part of it we spend time in. It's a very quaint place. Carries a lot of Johto vibes in my opinion. There is just the one town here, and then it's surrounded by apple orchards and rice fields. I would say that aesthetically, it is a step up from Paldea. There's just a greater vibrance and richness to everything here. I'd love to play a whole game in a region like this. It's definitely my kind of vibe. We're here on this school trip to experience the culture of the region, and more specifically, the Festival of Masks that takes place here every year. We arrive in our base of operations, Masui Town, and quickly become acquainted with a couple of new friends. This is Carmine and her younger brother Kieran, whose hair just gives me the worst anxiety imaginable. Carmine is quite a frosty personality. She's not big on outsiders coming to Kitakami. She comes off as quite rude and dismissive at first, but she does open up and show her softer side as time goes on. I personally found her a bit insufferable at first, very angsty, Seems like she listens to a lot of Simple Plan when we're not around. But I warmed up to her over time. Deep down you can see that she really cares about her little brother as well. Kieran, on the other hand, is a very shy, very introverted boy who spends a lot of time hiding behind his older sister. But he's very curious as well, so he does find ways to push through that shyness when he needs to. I didn't have many thoughts on Kieran during most of this DLC, he's just a nervous little kid. He gets way more interesting later on though. So we spend a decent chunk of time learning about Kitakami and the legend of the Loyal Three, which tells the story of an awful ogre that once attacked the village, where 3 brave Pokemon stepped in to try to protect it, sadly perishing in the process. There's a lot of death in this game, isn't there? Kieran, though, has a strange infatuation with this creature, despite it being the villain of the story. Well, as it turns out, the ogre, which is actually a Pokemon called Ogerpon, isn't the true villain of the story, and everything the villagers believe is a lie. The Loyal Three are actually the evil Pokemon that stole Ogerpon's masks and also killed its owner. That's death number 4 of this DLC, by the way. Ogerpon raced down to the village in a rage to take revenge and defeat those evil Pokemon, which the villagers misinterpreted as Ogerpon attacking the village and the Loyal Three defending it. That's the 411 of the story of this DLC. Of the 2 DLCs that were announced, this is the one I was looking forward to the most, because it looked like the more story-heavy DLC. And it is a decent little story. It's not a long one, you can finish it in about 3 hours or so. I found that I guessed the twist fairly quickly, considering they did pretty much the exact same thing with Team Star's narrative. From the moment we first encounter Ogerpon at the festival and see how meek and timid it comes across, instantly I was like, nah, this definitely isn't the villain here, something else is going on. The main drama that comes out of all this is the fact that you end up catching Ogerpon when Kieran is the one that's been swooning over it for years. And this spirals Kieran into the beginnings of a villain arc right as we close out of the Teal Mask. So it ends on quite the cliffhanger. I think I liked just learning about the culture of Kitakami and taking in the atmosphere of the place more than anything else in this DLC. I did enjoy the optional part at the end where you can pay to rebuild the Loyal Three shrine, because even though the legend is a false one, it still inspires people to do good, and it's an important part of the town's history and culture. And I feel like that mirrors real life in many ways. A lot of our customs and rituals have become far detached from their origins, but we continue to observe them anyway, because it brings communities together. A lot of good and kindness comes out of those traditions, even if it turns out that they were founded on false events or misinterpretations. There's not a whole lot else to do here aside from the story. There is the ogre ousting minigame where you have to collect berries by popping the corresponding balloons and place them on the podiums at the top before the time runs out. The game itself isn't that exciting, it's probably more fun if you team up with friends to do it. It didn't interest me enough personally to do that. There's also a side quest here if you catch enough Pokemon for the Pokédex, initiated by a quirky little Hot Topic queen over here. This is Perrin. She's a photographer also here visiting Kitakami. She's here to try and snap a photo of the Blood Moon Beast, which turns out to be a new variant of Ursaluna, which is absolutely sick by the way. I love this thing so much. This little quest was actually one of the highlights of the Teal Mask for me, because it did a good job of building up a bit of anticipation for what you're about to see. If you didn't run across any leaks or spoilers, this was a pretty epic moment seeing Blood Moon Ursaluna for the first time. One thing we all kept our copium masks on for was a big performance patch to go with the DLC, but somehow the opposite kinda happened. Kitakami runs even worse than the base game in many places. Those moments where the game struggles and goes into slow motion for a few seconds are far more frequent here than they are in Paldea. Not sure how that's even happened, but it unfortunately confirmed to us all that a performance patch wasn't coming. This is just how the game's always going to be. But overall, I came away from the Teal Mask feeling mostly satisfied. Some cool new Pokemon, a really nice new map to run around in when it doesn't lag, and a story that gives the region some strong character. 3 months later and the second part of the DLC drops, the Indigo Disc. In this DLC, we go on another school trip to a different region, but this time one we're familiar with already, the Unova region. But don't get too excited about it because we're not going to Unova. We're going to the Blueberry Academy, which is a school just like ours that sits right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean apparently. The main attraction here is something called the Terrarium, which is a bit like an artificial safari zone contained within a huge dome underneath the ocean. It's pretty out there. But it's really fun to run around in. There are 4 different biomes here and loads of past Pokemon added to the game for you to catch, including some of the Alolan variants. There's also a bunch of new features, one being the Synchro Machine, which I swear was the name of my Yu-Gi-Oh deck back in 2011. This thing allows you to synchronize your brain with your Pokemon's brain and lets you run around as your Pokemon. Very gimmicky, but quite fun to mess around with. You will auto-battle Pokemon when you go near them too. Just hope you don't come across a shiny because you can't stop yourself from knocking it out if you do. The best usage I've seen of this mechanic is actually people using it to play hide and seek, where people try to blend in with the other Pokemon around them. I need to give that a try someday because it looks like a blast. Another thing you can do with your friends is BBQs, Blueberry Quests. Nothing to do with burgers and chicken wings, unfortunately. These are continuously respawning quests that appear in the side menu, such as taking a photo of a specific Pokemon, picking up a certain number of items, stuff like that. Each one earning you some Blueberry points, which can then be used to unlock certain features within the game. Now you can do these on your own as well, but I highly recommend doing these with other people. So if you complete a quest on your own and get 20 points, that's 20 points for you. Fantastic. If you're playing with other people, everyone in your party gets 20 points. So you can probably guess how fast the points rack up if you have a full party of 4 doing these quests. If you don't have people to play with, join some general Pokemon Discord servers. A lot of them have dedicated channels where people are constantly looking for other players to team up with. It can feel a bit grindy at times, but as I said, if you play with other people, seeing that number flying up in the corner feels really good. You get an instant feedback from your efforts, and that makes this a lot more fun than it might appear on the outside. Also, we get another upgrade to our Ride Legendary, allowing it to fully fly instead of simply gliding slowly to the ground. This is something pretty much everyone wanted in the base game, but I'm glad that it did eventually get added. It's a real quality of life improver. You don't unlock it until the very end of the DLC, but it's nice to have for post-game stuff. The Indigo disc is more about the battle inside of Pokemon. It's essentially a second Elite Four challenge, with a surprise champion at the end of it. That champion being none other than Kieran, but he's changed. Stemming from the events back in Kitakami, he's now gone full Joker and developed an insatiable thirst for power, which has led him to the very top of the pecking order here at Blueberry Academy. All this because you caught Ogerpon and he didn't. There's even a special line of dialogue that triggers if you send Ogerpon out against him in the champion battle. But of course, we're the main character here, so we prevail and become the new champion of Blueberry Academy. And I think it's quite telling seeing everyone disperse so quickly after Kieran's defeat. What we see here is a character that so aggressively bulldozed his way to the top that he hasn't made any friends or allies along the way, and so he garners no sympathy when he loses that champion throne. Some characters actively revel in it. When you value yourself only by the power you hold, other people will come to value you solely by that metric too. It's an important lesson in grace and humility as a competitor. And this is where the story loops back around to the original narratives of the games, as we're asked to join one of the Academy's teachers, Briar, in a second expedition down to Area Zero, to track down the legendary Pokemon, Terapagos. This is where my brain was hooked back in, because we've known about the existence of Terapagos pretty much since the beginning of the game. After 2 DLCs, the game is now circling back to push in the final missing pieces of the main story. So down we go again, back to Zero Lab, except this time we learn that there are deeper depths to Area Zero than we previously thought. It doesn't look all that different down here to the regular depths of Area Zero, except for the Terra Crystals being amped up by 3 or 4 times. It's just a big cave, all said. But there is something quite interesting down here. There are Pokemon down here with a brand new Terra type, known as the Stellar Terra type. Now bear with me as I remind myself what this thing does because it's kinda weird. In fact, let me just plaster the Bulbapedia entry on screen for a few seconds, that's a lot easier. It's kinda convoluted, but it basically boosts every type once per usage. I personally have found 0 use for this unique Terra type. I honestly haven't used it once. But maybe it's useful in some competitive battling or something, I'm not sure. If you're into VGC, let me know in the comments if the Stellar Terra type is being used. But yeah, we're tasked with defeating some of these Stellar Pokemon to clear the path to the thing we're actually here to find. The legendary Pokemon and the origin of terrestrial energy, Terapagos. I had many images in my mind about what this mysterious disc Pokemon could look like, after staring at this image in the Scarlet Violet book for so long. I didn't expect it to be this little dude right here. It's another cutesy legendary. It's more common to see mythicals take this cutesy aesthetic, so it was surprising to see the actual source of terrestrial energy itself be this tiny, sparkly-eyed turtle. But it's a thrilling end to the game, and it ties up those loose ends. Kieran initially catches Terrapagos in a Master Ball, because, he knows what happens last time and doesn't want to get burned again. But when it terastallizes, it becomes so powerful and out of control that it breaks that Master Ball clean in two. And it's at this point where we really see how much this was all just an act for Kieran up until this point. Because he pretty quickly reverts back to being that timid, scared young boy we met in Kitakami. And in the end, it's our encouragement that brings out the genuine fight in him. And eventually, he helps us quell Terrapagos, which we then go ahead and catch, and the adventure is concluded. I've got to say, I do sort of feel bad for Kieran, because a lot of his role in this DLC is just watching us rock up on his turf and become the hero. He doesn't really get anything out of this. I suppose he gets a new friend, that's something. Overall, this was an okay ending. I did feel like it was over a bit fast. I think I expected more build up to it. Instead, it was just kind of thrust upon us after becoming Blueberry Champion. But it was big, it was dramatic, and that made it memorable. Also, just a quick word of thanks to Game Freak for putting me in the game. That was so sweet of you, thank you so much. And so, the credits roll once more, and that is the end of the game. Or is it? Just a few weeks after the Indigo disc dropped, we got another announcement that an epilogue to Pokémon Scarlet and Violet would be releasing in January of 2024. In Mochi Mayhem, we go back to Kitakami with our OG group of friends from Paldea, and we meet back up with Carmine and Kieran too. It's only a short epilogue, but it's quite fun. It's very unserious. It centers around a mythical Pokemon called Petrarunt, who's actually been sitting on the counter of this Kitakami shop the whole time, it turns out. This is the leader of the Loyal Three. This thing is what ordered them to go steal the masks from Ogerpon in the first place. And now it's controlling the people of Masui Town and making them do a chicken dance? What are we doing here? This is like late seasons Riverdale levels of weird. So this virus spreads throughout the village when the people eat mochi that's been contaminated with Petrarunt's powers. And we have to defeat Petrarunt to bring everyone back to normal. That's the bulk of it really, but it was really fun. Especially seeing the two friend groups colliding and interacting. That was something I wanted from the beginning. I really wanted Nemona, Arven and Penny to come with us during the Teal Mask. It felt kind of like I was abandoning them and leaving them behind, so it was really cool to see them over here in Kitakami. A fun little adventure to wrap up the whole Loyal 3 saga. Story-wise, this game has to be in the top 3 in the series for me. I love the underlying lore of Paldea and Kitakami. Even though a lot of it wasn't fleshed out as much as I'd have liked it to have been, it was an experience that kept me gripped to my console. On first playthrough, I remember thinking it seemed kinda crappy that you needed to buy the DLC to experience the true ending to the Area Zero story and get the full picture of it all. But playing through it again, I think you could consider the base game the ending if you wanted to. If you're okay with having a few things remaining a bit of a mystery, then this could be your official ending to the adventure, and it does work. It's a different way of doing things compared to Sword and Shield's DLC, which has nothing to do with anything that happened in the base game. They sort of exist in their own bubble. The story is definitely what carries these games in my opinion. It's the reason why I say that if the performance issues weren't there, we'd be hailing these games as the best Pokemon games by a country mile. I really do believe that. There's also a lot of content in these games. Across the base game and the DLCs and the epilogue, no one can complain about the amount of stuff to do. Unfortunately, there's a lot that goes into judging how good a game is. And you can have the best ideas and the most features in the world. If the execution is lacking, people are going to be disappointed. But I do have hope that these games will be remembered more for what they did right than what they did wrong. You can see that there is genuine effort here to push Pokemon games to the next level. But they're just missing the mark in a few key areas. The main one being the game's performance. These games confirmed that the glaring concerns from the previous generation were not a one-off event. There is a deeply rooted game development problem at Game Freak that needs addressing, because they won't get away with this forever. Personally, I'll remember these games for moments like this, the moments that evoked an emotional response from me. I feel a tinge of nostalgia watching them back already, and I hope that everyone else has managed to take something out of these games too. Whether it's a new favourite Pokemon, a character you saw part of yourself in, a location you really vibed with. I really do want the best for the video game side of Pokemon. It's my main point of engagement within the franchise, so I always try my best to find a balance of critiquing the bad and also enjoying the genuinely good. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet are a dreamy mess. They're great, but they also deserve better. With the few changes that are happening behind the scenes at Pokémon, I am optimistic about the future of Pokémon games, and I have a feeling that we may end up having Scarlet and Violet to thank for taking the hit, so to speak, so that future games can really shine. But overall, I enjoyed Pokémon Scarlet and Violet for what they are, and I'm looking forward to what's next. Until then, hasta la vista, trainers.